Alrighty, hello everyone. Welcome back to SFC's Food for Thought series. For those of you who are just seeing SFC for the first time, we are an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals who believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Students for Canada if you want to learn more about what we do. Today, we are hosting Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot to discuss energy affordability and the global energy crisis. Heather is a senior policy analyst at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a senior consultant at Morris Interactive, and a global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. She also serves as a research and communications advisor for the Indigenous Resource Network. Heather sits on the boards of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, the Saskatchewan Indigenous Economic Development Network, and the Arctic Institute. She is also the managing editor of the Arctic Yearbook and the former chair of the Canadian Northern Studies Trust. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of Calgary. I will now share the spotlight with our guest. Welcome, Heather.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here. I'll just start sharing my screen. So you guys have asked me to talk about energy security and the energy crisis and energy affordability today, and I'm happy to do it because I'm just obsessed about it lately. The energy crisis is kind of a macro trend and will affect every corner of every kind of politics in every country in the world. So it's definitely a huge issue and definitely something we should be paying more attention to and trying to, come up with a credible response. So I'll kind of, it's a high level. We don't have too much time, but I'll kind of go quickly through all the different elements and then look forward to your questions. So just thinking, so you may have heard, some people think we're in an energy crisis, and we have been in energy crises before. So that's, it's not the first crisis. And a crisis is, where there's not enough reliable, affordable supply, basically. And in Canada, we're actually very blessed. We have a tremendous energy resources. We have excellent hydro. I think we're the fourth largest producer of hydro. So the fourth largest export of hydro. We have tons of oil, third largest reserves in the world, tons of natural gas. We have nuclear. We're starting to get geothermal, some pilot projects in geothermal coming along, and there are some places that have good solar and wind capacities too. But overall, our energy mix is very diverse, it's pretty reliable, and it's very cheap. So compared to other developing nations, Canada actually has quite cheap energy, even though if it doesn't feel like that this month. But we are blessed in that way, which is to say that there are many countries in Asia and Europe especially that are energy importing countries that aren't blessed with those domestic reserves and have to import energy. And so this is affecting them much more than it is in Canada. In one way, we benefit when oil and gas prices go up because we are exporters, even though you individually and consumers individually might be feeling the pain. Alberta is generating more royalties, the government of Canada is getting more revenues, that kind of a thing. But there are many countries for which this is, a very serious problem. So how did we get here in 2022 to have an energy crisis? And I don't know how much you guys have covered of all this, and I'm sure some of you follow energy Twitter and that kind of thing, so you might be familiar, but just kind of a macro historical kind of situation. There was a huge oil boom, from about 2007 to 2014. And I think the price of a barrel hit $140 at one point. In 2008 dollars, which would be like hitting probably 170, 180 today. So that was a huge boom. Part of the reason, and there's a commodities boom in general. So it wasn't just oil, it was all kinds of commodities. So agricultural products, lumber, minerals, all those things. And that was largely led by China, just emerging, growing very fast economically, and just being hungry for every kind of resource. And that led that boom. What happened? Why did it become a bust in 2014 was the US shale revolution. So that was a combination of fracking, basically able to access far more, whereas US was an importing, oil importing country for decades. And that's where, led to Middle Eastern wars and that kind of thing. Finally became actually a net exporter in 2018 and is today the world's largest producer of oil and gas. So in terms of energy and oil and gas, just a massive transformation, a massive earthquake in the energy kind of field. And so where the US became from a very hungry consumer importer to an exporter, flooded the market, gas prices, natural gas prices plummeted, oil went down and that kind of thing. So what has happened since? So cheap US shale flooded the market. Prices went down. There's no reason to have any more investment. So investors were losing money on oil and gas. They weren't getting their money back. Stopped investing into more production because there was too much on the market. And then we also had climate policies start to play into that, and ESG, or the environment, social, and governance investment policies play into that, where many investors, large pension funds, those kinds of things, didn't want to invest in oil and gas anyways. It wasn't making a lot of money, and then for ethical reasons did not want to invest. And so that means that there's been very little capital expenditures, investments going into the sector since 2014. And then you get COVID-19 and the pandemic, and production and demand collapses even worse in 2020. So on top of a bad situation, you got even a worse situation, even less investment, even more disruption, even lower demand. Now, you guys know demand has rebounded. So probably this year we will hit new records for coal demand, for oil demand. LNG has hit record prices. There's not enough supply to meet demand. Inventories keep going down. So now we're in crisis. Now we went through a cycle where there was too much, we invested too much, and now we've gone to a cycle where we didn't invest, and now we have to catch up. The question now is, can we catch up? Because there's different factors in play with climate policies and investment policies that are going to make it much harder to catch up. Even though prices of the barrel and LNG and natural gas are high, they're still not coming, product still isn't coming online like it would have in the past. And so I'll just quickly go through a few charts to demonstrate why I think we'll still be in crisis for a couple more years. There's certainly no short term, and maybe no medium term solutions unless we see a lot of production go down. OPEC, which I think controls about 65% of the market, so that's oil producing and exporting countries, mostly Middle East, but a few others. OPEC plus includes Russia, having a hard time bringing more production on. So since the fall, even the Biden administration was begging for more supply, encouraging them to produce more supply. Yes, even after they canceled Keystone XL from Canada. But OPEC is having a hard time actually bringing more supply on. And that's never been a problem. OPEC could always bring on, they were already trying to restrict their supply to control the market, but now they cannot catch up. So we're seeing in this chart, hard time getting that production up to levels that they say they can meet, that the IEA and the Biden administration say they want them to meet. What about the United States, the world's largest producer now? You can see they kind of had a slow, steady rise until COVID hit. COVID went down, and we have not seen them catch up. They're still a couple million barrels off of catching up on their crude production. Will that change? Here's the oil rig count. So if you don't have more rigs, different rigs have different production levels. But in the last 3 years, we've seen that big drop from COVID, and it's slowly, but not, the angle is not going that far up. And of course, they have supply chain issues, labor issues, all those things too conspiring. And plus, investors just want money and dividends. They don't want it invested in more production, more rigs. So we're not seeing rig counts go up. Here's the forecast, and inventories are not going up. So the blue line is how much oil and gas OECD countries have in their oil and gas inventories. We're still drawing down. We're still depleting. We're not adding yet, to our oil inventories around the world. So we'll see if that changes or not, but it hasn't changed yet. And this is OPEC. Why does this matter? This is OPEC, and they're probably the most bullish, but they think that oil demand is that red line. They think even if the economies don't do great, oil demand is going to rise. I think everyone thinks that, even if you're the IEA or environmental organization, oil is going to rise for another decade. OPEC sees it plateauing, not declining really fast after that. So we're going to need today's levels and more of oil and gas for the next 30 years. And it's not coming from anywhere right now. So these are why people are getting concerned about the long term. So the IEA, that's the International Energy Association, defines energy security as the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. And I think for most governments, most consumers, you're agnostic on where your energy comes from. I don't care if it's hydro or nuclear or natural gas. Some people might care a little bit, but in general, we don't care. We want the cheapest, most affordable, most reliable source. And the fact is, Fossil fuels provide most of that because you can transport it, because they are very energy dense, because they're found all around the world. And it's very hard to replace those elements of oil and gas and coal. And we're still having a hard time with that. Renewables are not coming online fast enough to meet that gap in the production. We've seen many wars. The history of the last 50 years has really been about oil, who has it and who wants it. So the 1970s energy crisis was over American-Israel policy. I won't go into Israeli-Palestinian politics, but that triggered a response in the Middle East where they embargoed oil. That was the hammer that they had on the United States, on Western allies, and created an energy crisis where prices went up 3-4 times in a year. And that was very destabilizing. And then American foreign policy very much gets centered on having allies and reliable partners in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia. And there's many things that go around with that. So if you think of even Iran, Iraq, all those wars, Kuwait, it has a lot to do with American foreign policy and needing to have a reliable, uninterrupted availability of energy sources, and Asia and Europe as well. Why you haven't heard about the Middle East as much in the last 10 years is because now the United States, with the shale revolution, doesn't rely on the Middle East. Now it's an exporter. And so having, intervening in the Middle East hasn't been as important. And broadly, that's a good thing. It's maybe bad for some and good for others, but overall a good thing. But now we're seeing in Europe what happens, now it's Russia and Europe that's having that problem, where Russia has the supply. Europe relies on an extensive amount. In the medium term, there's no way for them to get off Russian gas. If Russia decides to cut it off, because if there are sanctions applied to it for invading Ukraine, people would go without heat. That's just how it would be. They would go without heat. And people do not tolerate that. People do not tolerate not having power. Factories would close, industry would collapse, people could not move, it would be a terrible crisis. And that's why the Biden administration right now is scrambling to find more LNG from Australia, from Qatar, from whoever they can to try to replace if Russia decreases their supply. Why isn't Canada in that discussion? We do not export LNG. We don't have a single LNG exporting terminal. We export natural gas by pipe to the United States. They're our only market. They are our only customer. Because we don't have our own. In fact, we'll export Canadian natural gas to the United States. They'll buy it from us for cheap, and then they'll turn it to LNG and they'll export it overseas at higher European and Asian prices. So you can say, did Canada have a good LNG policy that we still don't have a single terminal? That's kind of biting us right now. So a little bit on energy affordability and why this kind of matters and why this will hit domestic politics, I think, sooner rather than later. You guys know, if you're students and you're paying your own utility bills, that you probably got a big one this month. It was a cold December. The carbon tax has been rising, and the natural gas prices have been higher than they have been, for probably a decade. So I certainly got a big shock. But for a lot of people, it's not just like, oh, now I can't go skiing this weekend, or I can't go to a restaurant. I was up north in northern Alberta and talked to people in a Métis settlement who are actually using wood stoves and actually using candles because they're trying to cut down on energy prices, that had their energy cut off because they hadn't paid their bill. And it's an $8,000 re-hookup fee to get the power back on. So this isn't, this is a big issue for a lot of people in Europe, and it's even worse in Europe, where they already had higher energy prices and they've gone up even higher. So if you think it's bad in Canada, and it is, it's far worse in Europe. 80 million houses were already struggling to keep their homes warm before the pandemic. 12 million households were already a year with utility bills, and now prices are in some places 2, 3, even 5 times higher. So imagine the politics of that. And just to give you, this is a Canadian energy poverty picture. This is also from before the pandemic, so it would be worse, much worse now. But Atlantic Canada, because they have lower incomes, a larger portion of their income has to go to utilities, to energy costs. So higher gasoline prices, and those are at record highs in Canada right now. And also a lot of them use furnace oil for their heat. So they don't have the same hydro and nuclear that they do in Ontario and Quebec, which hasn't gone up as much. Alberta, we're pretty blessed. I think we must, because we have high incomes. British Columbia has good hydro. None of it, I think, is only because so many houses are publicly where the government, the state pays for the utility bill. So it's just a smaller thing. Why is it important to have reliable, affordable access to energy? And it seems like obvious, but a lot of our policies lately with climate policies, and there's obviously pros and cons, have been to reduce energy consumption, to lower energy consumption. But in fact, energy use per capita is almost perfectly correlated with everything that we think is important, societal well-being. This chart is Human Development Index. So it shows you the more energy that people in your country use, the higher you are on the Human Development Index. But also, you know, just about everything: literacy, gender equality, access to clean water, child mortality, all of that improves with higher energy use per capita. So if, you know, just reducing the amount of energy that we all use in the globe is not a great solution if you care about those other societal things. So it can't just be reducing energy use. It has to be replacing energy use with something else. Now you can see, though, to be fair, in a place like Canada, there is some room where we could, you know, lower our energy use, and it wouldn't, you know, you go from 300 to 200 and your Human Development Index is still pretty good. But almost all the growth in energy use is going to come from Africa and Asia. In fact, we do expect that oil and gas demand will go down. Oil demand, certainly coal demand, will go down in developed countries. But of course, India and Africa are going to add 1 billion people, you know, in the next 10, 15 years. And so if all those people even just use the same amount of energy, it would grow. If they move into the middle class, if they move up this scale of energy per capita Human Development Index, they're going to use even more energy. So where is that going to come from? So this is where it will get interesting, I guess, in Canada. This is where I think we can look down and see what's going to happen to us in a year or two, because it's happening in Europe now, is that because of this energy crisis, almost every EU country has out some kind of emergency measure. So either energy tax cuts or straight up subsidies, sometimes directed at poor households. So in Norway, for example, where they are very rich, they are making, you know, they're getting a windfall off of high oil and gas prices. Government is just paying 55% of household power bills for the next few months. Spain has, for example, these are common policies, but just as examples, has suspended its VAT, its value added tax. So like its HST on its electricity bills. Biden administration, a Democrat left-leaning government gave an additional $4.5 billion to home energy relief. So applies to utility bills of low-income Americans. That is a direct fossil fuel subsidy. Released 50 million barrels from its strategic petroleum reserves in November to try to put a tap on gas prices. And they're saying now that they're going to do it again. And it's not a great intervention. It's a very short fix. It doesn't solve the issues in the long term. In fact, if anything, it exacerbates them. But that's their strategy. Gas prices are a very important political issue in the United States. They don't, they wouldn't want it to be over $1 a liter, that we're paying in Canada. So actively doing things to bring down gas prices, even though, in Canada, we're applying carbon taxes to increase gas prices to disincentivize people from driving. So it's just funny to see how different the policy response in the US is. Japan, a direct subsidy to gas prices, gasoline in your car prices of 5 yen a liter, subsidizing oil distributors to apply it for consumers at the pump. So we're 3 months after COP26, and these are direct fossil fuel subsidies that the richest countries in the world are applying. Let alone, how do you think this impacts the poorest consumers and their driving habits? So I guess, the discussion that we can have, or the discussion Canada is going to have at some point. How long can we just stay out of this energy conversation? We have the third largest reserves in the world and the most of any democracy. So if you don't want to rely on Saudi Arabia and Russia, and you don't think American oil production is just going to decline as proportion, then you might want, if you're thinking 30 years and the energy security implications of all this, the geopolitical implications, you might want to make sure that Canada is still producing oil and gas. And in fact, that's what the head of the IEA said when they released the Canada report just last month, is that he'd like to see countries like Canada that have a good record, are democratic, are friendly allies, still producing. If we have to have oil and gas, and we will for decades to come, it should probably come from Canada. We're not exporting any LNG today. How long is that tenable from a geopolitical perspective? from our Asian allies, from our European allies, to not bring that resource to market. One reason why Canada is in this for the long term is because oil sands have comparatively low decline rates. That means we have to invest far less capital into those oil sands mines now than you would have to in the United States. Whereas the United States, they're declining, 10, 20% a year. So your rig is no good after 5 years. You have to constantly be investing into that. The oil sands are declining at a slow pace. So if it's a marathon, the oil sands are going to win the marathon. If it was a race, we weren't doing too well. But in a marathon of energy, oil sands are in for long term if they can keep producing. And then this raises, this is the quadrillion dollar question for the world. How can we make sure our climate policies match our energy and our security policies? Because there's a mismatch right now. But I don't think we can just only focus on climate policies and not consider these, for much longer.